go.
Can't see it dancing.
Where's the tape? Come on, you missed. All right, so we're live.
We're
Yeah,
live.
we're live
We
now.
were just having a little dig.
We're just doing a little dance behind.
Here we go. All right, guys. G'day. My name is Craig or Crafty from Craftworks Distillery. I'm out in Capity in New South Wales, Australia, planet Earth, and I am one of three of Aussie craft distillers shooting the shit. Now, for those who are watching and not seen this before, basically we just shoot the shit. We just have conversations with people in the industry, both locally and internationally. It's freewheeling. There's no editing. And we just go wherever the questions
Sometimes
go.
I wish there was, but hey,
Bit of structure would be good sometimes, maybe. We try to go for an hour and a half. We have been known to push it 2 and a bit hours. So we'll see how we go. Yeah, I know. So first of all, I'll introduce my co-host. On the top box is the Luke and the Todd. Hey guys, how are you?
Todd,
Yeah,
Luke. Hello.
Just to clarify.
doing
all right.
great.
Yeah. All right. And our special guest tonight, very, very special, means a lot to me because I'll talk about Westland shortly, but we've got Andy Bunton, who's up on the top right, Brady Bunch Square. Andy, how are you, mate?
Yeah, good, Crafty. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, mate, it's good you're here. Looking forward to a good chat. And then on the down at the bottom, now I need my Brady Bunch thing back. That's better. Okay, so we've got Chris, who set his alarm clock at 5:45 a.m. so he could shoot the shit with us, and he's probably going to be drinking whiskey with us, I hope. So Chris is VP of Sales of Westland. Is that correct, Chris?
It is correct. Yeah.
Cool. Excellent.
Last I checked.
Got one thing right. That's a good start. So Chris, welcome. Thank you very much for coming, mate. And yeah, we'll just rip straight into it. So the first thing we do is we encourage people who are watching to drink something Australian. Now we're drinking something American, thanks to the courtesy of Westland. So Andy, you got those samples to us in advance. So thank you very much, mate. That was good.
Fantastic. They got there. I was a bit concerned about Australia Post, and that's why I sent them about 3 months earlier.
Yeah, yeah, just to play it safe, you know. Yeah, Australian Post. Let's not get started. All right. So, what we're going to do is we're going to taste a couple of Westland whiskies as we shoot the shit, and going to kick it off with here's the bottle, Luke, because you got the bottle. I posted it to you with Australian Post, and it got there in time for a change. Where is it?
No, it didn't.
You haven't got them.
You were just saying about Australia Post. They fucked it up as usual.
You're kidding?
No, not here.
Oh, I said it last week. Sorry, guys. All right.
But here's one I prepared earlier.
Oh, okay, good. I've got some of the samples here anyway, so I can go through it.
So I've got that one. But no, Australia Post have shafted us once again. They did it with my Black Snake Pechuga.
Yeah.
They lost a bottle of that, and I tell you what, Rosemary was devastated.
Yeah.
That disappeared. And they've also done it to a couple of my other bottles as well. So I don't know what it is about my house. They just don't seem to like me.
That's just Australia Post.
Bastards.
We
so you're going to have to do the tasting notes for us.
Yep.
And
That's fine.
when we get to the peated, which is what I'm actually having a glass of right now.
Yep.
And just on that Australia Post, if you're listening, we do accept endorsements.
Australia Post, we're putting you in the same category as Telstra. So that's saying something. Anyway, that's enough in jokes. That's enough in jokes. Let's rip into this. So, Chris, are you drinking anything? Andy, are you drinking anything?
I am going to be terribly honest. I am not drinking anything, and only because my rental car, it is like 2 miles away from my hotel. So originally we had planned on doing this last week as a group, and I was going to be seated in my nice, comfortable home, drinking along with you in that exact moment. And then it turns out, terrible at telling time as a collective group here, the five of us.
It's not good.
And yes, we were basically trying to figure out how many hours ahead, behind, weeks ahead, or weeks behind Australia is to the eastern part of the US. And it turns out we should just trust the internet more often, which is something I never thought I would actually say out loud.
Yeah.
So I am literally in a hotel somewhere in Miami right now. There is whiskey in the back of like the smallest Jeep little hybrid thingy I've ever seen in my life. And I couldn't even begin to tell you, if I walked outside of this hotel, where that car is right now.
Is there no minibar?
Where are
they putting you up? Is there no minibar?
I will tell you, if there's one thing that makes me sad about hotels in America, is that the minibar, while not dead, COVID has effectively destroyed, because like there's not even a bag of chips in this hotel. There is literally the worst coffee you could possibly ask to be drank in your life, but there isn't. I mean, I'm pretty sure like a picture of whiskey is illegal in this hotel at this point. but I will say,
bottles up too high. Then
I'm sure you can probably hear it a bit in my voice. I did plenty of sampling last evening, so I can assure you that whatever you need me to describe for you, I'm the man to do so.
That's good. All right, Andy, you're drinking, mate. You must be.
I am, and it's actually funny that we had to move this back a week, because if we had done it last week, I would have been doing it from a hotel room in Sydney, with as pathetic a mini bar as what Chris was just talking about. So luckily now I'm comfortably sitting at home, and I've got the Westland American Oak that I'm drinking.
Good, excellent.
Nice.
I'm on the American Oak as well. Right. All right. Well, let's start talking. So, from my perspective, personally, some of the big influences on what I do at Craftworks were Corsair Distillery, Westland Distillery, Bruichladdich, and of recent Waterford. And so,
good company.
Yeah. No, I mean, I started with Bruichladdich. That was the Temple of Bruichladdich. I worship the Temple of Bruichladdich to this day. But Westland, I remember when Matt Hoffman presented at there was a whiskey conference in Scotland, and in 2017, and introduced Westland to the Scottish, and the approach of making whiskey and not trying to make Scotch. And I remember at the end, the room was just silent, and Dave Broom said, "Right, any questions?" And there wasn't one question from a Scotsman about making whiskey and the Americans making single malt whiskey, which I thought was really interesting. I thought Matt's presentation was amazing, and just ahead of its time, to be honest. So
I think it's a fair thing to say, and it's funny because I've just gotten back with our vice president of marketing, Steve, who's a good buddy of mine, and we found it was really interesting to do samplings, conversations, master classes, whatever you want to call them, over in Scotland, because there's the assumption that they're going to be the ones that push back against it the hardest. The reality is that we found it to be probably one of the most welcoming communities for what we're doing. Listen, there's no doubt you're a bit sort of going into the dragon's den and kicking it in the tail and going like, hey, we're here, just wanted to let you know. But at the same time, there's this element where I think they also appreciate that they just want to see good single malt whiskey available in the marketplace. And at Westland, we're certainly, obviously that's a compelling part of what we're trying to do. But I would say even more so, we're trying to show people that, we're not trying to disrupt Scotch and make Scotch in America. That's not even remotely the intention of what we want to do. I think you were kind of saying it, Craig, and the idea here is that, we want to be making something that's authentic, something genuine to America with a real sense of place. And it's funny because the four producers you mentioned before, if I were to think about something that's sort of the common red thread between all of them, it's the fact that we're all trying to make something with a genuine sense of place.
Yes, agree. 100% agree. And I remember reading something about Matt Hoffman. He was saying that people were saying, why doesn't Westland make bourbon? He goes, Why would we do that? We don't have corn. We have barley. We have good barley, some of the world's best barley. Why don't we do it with that? It makes so much sense.
It is a question that I mean, all right. So I just said earlier, I'm in Miami, came down here for a couple of events. We're doing this really big campaign called the Judgment of West, and I can get to that type of stuff later. But every single night, and it's been 2 straight nights, I've gotten the exact same question, which is, well, yeah, but when's your bourbon going to come out? And I'm just like, oh my gosh, like this is not even remotely the intention of what we're trying to do here, because it is literally so ingrained in the whiskey culture here that like American whiskey equals bourbon, that we when we try to explain to people that, you know, whiskey is nothing more than it's a distilled spirit made with cereal grains, right? Like, let's think of that from the very top line level. Well, when we tell people like, yeah, our cereal grains out in the Pacific Northwest are wheat and barley, and obviously we've got just an incredibly vibrant craft brewing community out in the Pacific Northwest, and there's an element to what we do at Westland that's paying homage to that. And people are just like, well, yeah, but when's the bourbon coming out? And you're just like, yeah, okay, I guess that's where this is going now.
So the category of American single malt whiskey is really starting to crystallize now in the US, isn't it? I think you're on the verge of actually getting, I don't know how you describe it, but recognition, certification, or whatever. Is that right? Am I right on that?
Yeah, you have to be careful, because if you say it out loud like 3 times, Beetlejuice will show up. But I will tell you, like, it is something like we are. I laugh because I've been at Westland now just about 6 years, and we've been talking about like, yeah, in the fall of this year or the spring of next year, it's going to happen. We're going to be recognized as an official category of spirit here in America. But I will tell you, and hand on my heart, we just had Steve from Westland just got back from a meeting with the TTB in Washington, D.C. like a week ago. And they were like, yes, we are ready to kind of move forward on this. The intention is that once they sort of announce the potential change, it will then get put into an open comment period. And that open comment period is an opportunity for them to say, okay, here's the published list of, we'll call it a standard of identity, what it actually is. And once that goes through that public comment period, it can get ratified. And then literally American single malt whiskey will be a legally enforceable category. If you look, you know, Crafty, if you look at the bottles that you have there, or sorry, Todd Luke, if you look at the bottle you have there, you'll notice that one of the neat things about it is like, we've actually had to be a bit clever with the packaging. So you'll notice that American single malt and the word whiskey don't appear on the same line.
Mm.
Right.
It's because we're legally required to do so, because according to our own federal government right now at this very moment, American single malt doesn't legally exist. Now we can do it because we produce Westland under the broad category of whiskey in America, but American single malt, this sort of, you know, very specific single distillery, 100% malted barley, you know, distilled to no higher than 80, bottled no lower than 40, you know, no specific component to an age statement, but matured in nothing larger than a 700-liter cask, oak cask. You know, those are things that we do as like a self-enforcement policy, but they're not required of us just yet. But we're hoping, literally, truly, by the spring of next year, this will be one of those things where actually, if you want to put American single malt whiskey on a bottle, here is the very precise standard of identity, much akin to the way the SWA does for Scotch whiskey, and says this is what it has to be in order to qualify for that.
That's happening around the world as well. I think Japan has recently defined, I don't think as legally,
still pretty loose, their definition.
Yeah, but they put some form of definition around what is a Japanese whiskey.
They literally had to. I think it had gotten to the point where, I mean, there's enough clever people in the industry that realized like whiskey could literally leave Scotland, like skip off a port in Japan, and it could turn around with kanji on the packaging and become Japanese whiskey. Like that's a problem. I will tell you, as a consumer who spends, God, a disgusting amount of money on whiskey, and I'm sorry, honey, I just want to be clear in advance, but as someone that spends too much money on whiskey,
she doesn't watch, so it's fine.
I'll tell you, it's one of those things where like I want as much transparency in the industry as well. And Craig, that's another term that you'll see if you were to ask those 4 producers you said earlier, Waterford, Goval, Bruichladdich, Westland. Transparency is an enormous part of what we all have as a mission.
Yeah,
absolutely. No, I mean, the company of Waterford goes so far as to put the individual thing on the bottle, you can trace the whole thing all the way back. It's interesting. Todd and I were, before we came on air, we were looking at your website and looking at the level of transparency that you've got.
We had a patent attorney. We had a patent attorney come for a tour and said we were alarmingly transparent at one point, which is like the greatest left-handed compliment you can get in America. It's like, you're just like, I think I know what you're trying to say, but they're right. I mean, listen, we make the joke, but it is a genuine thing. If you have like an extra $10 million laying around and you want to start your own version of Westland, like we'll gladly kind of help take you through the steps and show you the things that we do, because the reality is it's not just money to become great whiskey. There's a lot more that goes into it. And I think you guys, of anyone, people that are really in the industry would understand that. Like, it's not a matter of just, even though, listen, having great raw materials, being able to source those things relatively locally, all super important things, to be clear. But there's an enormous amount of like your sense of place, the culture. We say all the time, Westland is not only a reflection of like where we are from, but it is who we are as a people. And you can't, listen, I certainly have not met a distiller or I've not met a brand that has been able to successfully falsify that.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
no, the authenticity.
The story is huge. I mean, Crafty can certainly testify to that.
To what? Sorry, what was that? I missed that.
To the story. I mean, I guess your main tagline is humanizing the art of whiskey.
Yeah.
So people want the story.
That's our tagline: humanizing the art of whiskey, which is built on transparency, accessibility, and storytelling. But it's not the Craftworks show, so we're not talking about Craftworks. We're talking about Westland. I got a question for you, because this really does my head in, and I haven't been able to get a straight answer from an American distiller that I could understand the answer. So
no pressure or anything.
Yeah, I was going to say, Jesus, wait, let's set it up.
Here we go, guys, the deep dive. So in America, you use new American white oak, freshly charred barrels, right? And that's for bourbon. You can't go into, say, an ex-Oloroso sherry cask straight off the bat, can you? Is that just related to the bourbon category, or is it related to the whiskey category in general in the US?
It's actually option C, believe it or not. So it is legally. So bourbon, yes, legally, bourbon needs to start a new white American oak, charred new white American oak.
Right.
Whiskey does not technically need that. However, there are an enormous number of categories that do require the use of new white American oak. So we'll say sort of whiskey is the overarching category. There are a lot of subcategories that require that. That was actually a very specific part of the standard of identity for American Single Malt that we did not want added. So we didn't want it to require you to use new oak, because, and I was thinking about this a lot lately, good regulations, good governmental regulations, of which there are few and far between, they should act as a funnel, right? They should say, okay, as long as you're within these sort of guide rails, you can move forward to the next thing of what you want to be referred to as. What bad regulations do is they act as a box. They say, you must do X in order to be considered Z. And that was a huge thing that we wanted to avoid, because, and in particular, this is something that you need to be sensitive to for a barley-based spirit. Barley-based spirits are just so light-bodied in comparison to a corn and rye-based spirit. That's obviously the more commonplace thing done here. So if you say to a bourbon producer, just let's say a generic whiskey distiller here that's going to make a corn-based spirit, more often than not, they're going to want some kiln-dried new white American oak to help balance out some of the oiliness or some of the roundness and sweetness that the corn-based spirit has on its own. Whereas in a barley-based spirit, it's actually something you have to be really careful, because one of two things can happen. Either you're going to have to sit on the whiskey so long to allow that oak character to really degrade over time to balance itself out, or you're going to have to do what Westland's done, which is you have to basically kind of shoo away the use of kiln-dried new white American oak. So we still use quite a bit of new white oak, but we use air-dried much more akin to the way that a winemaker would. So those air-dried casks are 18 to 24-month curing times, and literally during that cure time, you're breaking down a huge amount of the tannin that exists in that. So by the time that we fill that style of oak with our distillate, we're not precipitating a huge amount of tannin into the new make spirit.
Right. Okay.
So you're not getting as much of that vanilla, like quintessential American oak, bourbon vanilla flavor.
You'll still get some of it, but yeah, I would say the intensity of it is a little bit different. But really, more than anything, it's that you lose a lot of that massive, aggressive tannin note. And again, you don't notice it when you drink a lot of bourbon or a lot of rye. And I would say a lot of American distilled spirits, because there's a corn-based distillate, because it does as a grain, corn does such a nice job balancing out against the tannin of kiln-dried oak. In barley, you just don't have that. I often think it's one of the major reasons why in the SWA or in most single malt Scotch whiskey producers, you'll tend to see a huge predominance of ex-bourbon there, because if they know that that's not going to completely destroy the character of the spirit, it's going to allow it to be sort of a more gentle and soft maturation.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. And if you know that you're going to want to hold spirit for 10 to 15 years, you don't need to use new oak at that point for the most part.
Right.
Well, tannins will kill a single malt whiskey very quickly. It'll really take over that kind of oakiness. So that's why it's good to, especially in Scotland, they use casks that have had something in it before that are good at holding onto tannins. And, American white oak doesn't have as many tannins as European oak, but, sherry is really good at holding onto them and taking some of them out. Tannins also being water soluble, so that, that air drying as opposed to kiln drying will allow, the 6 to 8 seasons of rain and snow and water and whatever to come and help to leach some of those tannins out and, make it a bit more accessible for maturing single malt whiskey.
Just break it down a bit. Yeah.
I thought Scotland just used ex-bourbon barrels because they cut down all their trees and didn't have any wood left to make their own barrels.
It's because they're cheap and Scots are tight.
Yeah. I think more than anything, it's a costing thing. But I'll touch on what Andy was saying the touch earlier, which is I remember the first time I went out to ISC. So Independent Stave Company is where we buy a huge amount of our new white American oak. They have 2 cooperages. They have the Kentucky cooperage, which is basically the bourbon cooperage. So it's mostly kiln dried coming out of that facility. And then they have what they affectionately refer to as like the wine cooperage, which is out in Missouri. And I mean, I remember when we got out there, the drying yard, which is just outside, it's got to be 50, 60, 70 acres at a minimum. I'm probably dramatically underselling that. And I mean, you're talking about just stacks of wood. I mean, stacks of palletized wood just as far as the eye can see. And I remember saying to Chad Spalding, who's our ISC rep, I looked down and I was like, oh man, you guys must have a ton of iron in your water. You're a lot of metal, because there was this like rust colored water everywhere. And that was literally the tannin that had precipitated and oxidized has this like really reddish color. And I was just like, that was one of those like watershed moments for me when I was like, holy shit, like, yeah, this is the other side of the moon. This is the way that you can do things when you're really specifically focused on the quality of raw materials and not just making an efficient style of whiskey.
Yeah, that's very cool. Before we go any further, Andy, I've just drunk my American oak. I really enjoyed it, as I always do. How would you describe it? What's your tasting notes when you're talking to people about this one?
So the thing that I talk to people about with Westland is that it's definitely a whiskey that will evolve according to the temperature. So, if you've just taken out the boot of your car like I have, so it's still quite cold from driving around on a miserable summer day in Melbourne. But the main flavors that I get from the American oak would be like a really rich, like Turkish coffee and 70% cocoa. They're the 2 main flavors that I get from this. And then there's a lot of other things that are going on that you might be able to pick up at different temperatures. You can add a dash of water, which helps to open it up a little bit as well, because it does start at, all the whiskeys are 46% and higher from Westland. Right. Obviously 46% being that magical number with dual filtration. So we don't do any of that at Westland, which is, again, creating an authentic whiskey, no colouring added as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, they're the 2 main flavors that I get from the American oak, which is that rich coffee and chocolate as well.
Quite buttery as well. Quite buttery on the nose and quite buttery in the mouthfeel. It's delicious. Absolutely delicious.
There's a lot of viscosity to that whiskey. There's like a natural weighting to it. And part of that's the 46, but I think the other element to it is that you're getting this, you're getting quite a bit of malt character. So both of you were mentioning this coffee and chocolate thing. That is the direct result of using roasted malts. 15 odd years in this industry, I have yet to taste a barrel that naturally produces coffee and chocolate as flavors, unless it held like, Mars bars and coffee before you put whiskey into it. And I'm pretty sure it doesn't
That would
exist
be
as a flavor.
amazing.
Yeah,
Crafty's just about to turn around and write that on his blackboard.
I just want to be clear. I've already sent something to the patent office.
Actually, I'll say something to that, Chris, though. I agree with what you're saying. I use base malts and roasted malts. It's a big part of where we started at Craftworks. We basically took a stout beer recipe and stripped it down, and that was the way we went. But I have experienced chocolate notes in whiskey that has had no roasted malts at all, and it's come down to the char. It's the barrel char. Under certain conditions, you can actually pick a chocolate note, which is, it did my head in first time I tasted it. Right, what do we drink next, Andy? The sherry?
We're going to the sherry next year.
Yep, all right, we'll go with the Sherrywood. Pour away, Todd and Luke. Pour away.
It's going to turn up tomorrow, isn't it?
It's gonna turn up tomorrow, most definitely, and then I'm just gonna drink it all.
That
I will. It's always kind of fun because obviously you guys are working through what we refer to as our core range, right? So the American oak, the sherrywood, the peated, those are the things that are, I mean, they're as foundational to what we do at Westland. But it's interesting because when I think back to the sort of origin story of each of those things, a big part of it was American oak was this opportunity to say, okay, plant the flag in the ground and go, this is what Westland wants to be. It's the use of a 5 malt, right? So Washington state grown base pale malt with 4 specialty roasted malts. We use a Munich malt, pale chocolate malt, a brown malt, and a malt literally called Briess Extra Special, which because they call it extra special because they already had a special malt. I kid you not. It's the use of Belgian Saison brewer's yeast. It's the use of that air dried new white American oak. So I tell people all the time, like in American oak, when you taste that whiskey, even though I would like to think that whiskey is really well balanced, really well rounded. It's not angular. It's not like one thing stands out and one thing doesn't get tasted. Like those whiskeys are designed to be where like you can literally kind of observe all of the raw materials in there. So like on the nose, we get a lot of these sort of like orange peel, lemon zest, dry cherry thing. That's a great example of a high fermentation temperature with our Belgian yeast. So we do, and I just realized I haven't done the calculations in my head, but we're about 80 degrees Fahrenheit. So I want to say that's maybe about 27-ish C, or I might be a touch high on that,
according to your website.
All right, yeah, I was going to say.
We did notice that you do use metric on the website.
Matt. So I would say Matt is like a hardcore proponent of the metric system. He is slowly but sure.
It's the right way. It's not just arbitrary numbers.
What's going on?
It is kind of funny because I've obviously in the pandemic of all things, I'm not doing as many sort of like in-person master classes. We're doing a lot more virtual things. And I've had to like go back and be like, God, don't forget the stupid conversion. Don't forget the stupid conversion kind of thing. But it is, but to get kind of back to the point, it's like, yeah, I mean, you can pick up some of that fermentation character on the nose. You can certainly taste the malt character. You guys were describing the chocolate and coffee yourselves. But there is this sort of like lingering finish. And I think, Craig, to your point, a lot of it is that new white American oak. It gives you a little bit of that butteriness, a little bit of that fullness, but it kind of wraps up the palate of the whiskey. And there's a little bit of length to that whiskey as well. So that's, when we made that whiskey, I think it would surprise people to know like that was the first thing that we made. Whereas the safe thing to have done would have been to say like, we're going to make a sherried and we're going to make a peated, because people will immediately associate that with single malt whiskey. And the reality was that we said, no, we want to make the thing that, and I literally said this last night, what we do with Westland American oak, the use of the roasted malt, the use of the yeast, the use of the air dried new oak. If you were to talk to like 99% of distillers out there, that would be their limited edition whiskey. Like that level of creativity, that level of new thought, that level of pushing the borders or pushing the boundaries of whiskey, that would be their limited edition. And for us, that is literally like our everyday whiskey.
Yeah, it's cool.
Yeah, right.
That's very cool. So how did you go back to the start with Westland? Tell us the start of the story, and how did you get to a point where you hit the deck running with a whiskey ready to go? What was the R&D process putting it together? It was a bunch of guys who started as home brewers, and develop recipes?
It was two guys. Yeah, a bunch. I mean, technically a bunch could be two, but that counts. So,
Yeah.
I mean, I should be clear, and I want to be transparent. I've not been there since the beginning. I've been there for 6 years. So we've just celebrated our 10-year anniversary, but I've basically been there since we've been a commercial business, which, what a shocker. The guy that's in the sales department comes in when it becomes a commercialized business. So you'll have to appreciate that everything I'm telling you is sort of a secondhand story. But, obviously the business was founded by two high school friends, a guy by the name of Matt Hoffman, who's still our managing director and master distiller, and a guy by the name of Emerson Lamb, who's no longer in the business. So Emerson's father, David, financed the entirety of the operation at the beginning. But Matt was sort of this mindset where he wanted to make something that was focused on the Pacific Northwest, had this element of the flavors here. And to the point you were kind of making earlier, Craig, he was just kind of floored that, people were like, oh, just make bourbon, just do this, just do that, when we've got this incredible bounty of good quality malty grade barley available to us. So, early days of Westland, pre-commercialized Westland, there was literally an R&D facility out in like a boathouse in, Mason Lake on the Olympic Peninsula, where Matt and Emerson were just running small batches, trying different things. And that's where the genesis of the 5 malt comes through, which was, believe it or not, in the very, very first runs of Westland was just a 4 malt, and then added a 5th malt to it because we needed that little bit extra. The idea to use the air dried new white American oak comes out of there. The idea to use the brewer's yeast comes out of there. The very early days of Westland. So this would have been back 2010, 2011, when Westland was really starting to produce, let's call it commercial quantities of whiskey, but not yet selling anything. We had a local brewery, Odin Brewing, literally doing our mashing for us because we didn't have a facility that could support all of the size of that material. Over time, we moved to a smaller facility in South Park, which is a little neighborhood within Seattle. And now we're in our sort of, we'll call it what it is, our large production facility. And large production facility should be done with finger quotes. But, that's
all a matter of perspective, really.
Yeah, I laugh. I was trying to do the math. My assumption is that what we make annually at Westland would probably be made in about a week at like any of the big 5 in Scotland.
And about a year on at most craft distilleries here in Australia.
I mean, just out of curiosity, Craig, like how many barrels a day do you guys produce?
He
He said a day, didn't he?
He did say a day. What was that, 0.08%?
Basically, this year is a record for us, and if all goes according to plan, we'll have 3,000 liters down in the barrels.
Okay, so I mean that's the thing. Like, listen, there was a point at Westland where like a barrel every couple of days was like something to really be celebrated, like something that we're, now we're up to a couple of barrels a day and quite a few barrels a week, and it's, there was a time where we experimented. Sorry,
and your still capacity is 5,670 liters for the still capacity.
How big's that one again, Crafty?
970.
It's not about the size, Crafty. It's
how you
use it.
That's what people with small stills say.
But getting back to the origin story, Wesley, because I'm not touching that with a 10-foot pole. I'm going to tell you, it was your question, Craig, about commercial. One of the really sort of exciting things about Westland is that every ounce of Westland, every drop of every bottle of Westland that has literally ever existed has come off of Westland still. There's not an ounce of purchase stock in there. Everything that we do is ours. And in the day and age where so much of the industry is now, we'll develop a label, we'll develop a story, and then we'll eventually make our own liquid. I'm really proud of the fact that with our team, and we've got a fantastic production team who really cares about what they're making. And it's given us an ability to go out there and kind of say, like, yeah, this has been the evolution of the spirit. Like, we've just made a really interesting evolution of our releases here in the US that'll hit Australia maybe by the end of next year. It's an entirely new expression we're referring to sort of internally as flagship. And it's this understanding of like, we couldn't have made that whiskey a year ago. We've had all the stock, but we couldn't have made the whiskey a year ago because it required a certain level of maturity in our existing laid down stock to be able to get the flavors out of this new bottling that we wanted. And That's the kind of thing where I look back and I laugh. Listen, for what it's worth, before I came to work at Westland, I was working for Gordon and MacPhail, a country with literally like 130-year history, where everyone that was my boss had the same last name, which was this incredible experience. They were just fantastic people. And it gave me an opportunity to learn about whiskey at a broad level. Coming to Westland, where it's, I think we have 30 employees, if I'm being honest, and I've been there since the evolution of us being an independent and then a startup and now part of a larger spirits company. You get a chance to just see that, like, the work doesn't change. You do the same work no matter what the scale is. It's maybe the way that you get time to speak about those things, and frankly, the freedom you have to talk openly about that. That's something that we're really keen on at Westland. Is like, we will literally tell you anything, because I think it's really important to have that communication, and it's important for the next wave of craft distillers coming up, not only in America but around the world, to understand that there's nothing to hide from here. Like, be genuine, be yourself, tell people the truth, and as long as you believe in what you make, you're going to produce good whiskey more often than not.
Yeah, no, that's good advice. What about when your parent company? So your parent company is Remy. Is that
Remy?
Right?
Yeah, Remy Cointreau.
So I know with Bruichladdich, Bruichladdich was fiercely independent. That was their basically their brand, right? And when they were acquired by Remy, there was a lot of concern that it was just going to destroy Bruichladdach's sense of identity. And that never actually happened. Remy basically left them alone from what it looks like, talking to people inside Bruichladdich and just people observing. Is it the same with Westland? Is that what happened?
100%, hand on heart, I can say absolutely that's exactly the same thing here. And here's, I've thought about this a lot over the last 5 or 6 years, and one of the reasons that it's been like that for us is truly because Remy, before the acquisition of Bruichladdich, was a company that worked with other distillers but didn't own other distilleries, right? They work with Highland Park, they work with Macallan, they had a good partnership going with the Edgerton Group. So they were in the whiskey business as a marketing and sales organization, but they weren't involved in the production and those sort of like elements of like deciding those things. So when they bought Bruichladdich, it was the first time that they could do those things. And to their credit, and frankly, to a level of restraint that's really hard for big companies to have often, they said, no, we're going to let you continue to do what you want. We bought you because we liked what you were doing. Why would we come in and say, yeah, we're going to, turn this screw this way one way and this one the other way? And I will tell you, because Simon Coughlin stayed with Bruichladdich and then was elevated to the CEO of the whiskey business unit, which obviously Westland's a part of with Bruichladdich and our sister facility, Domaine au Glas, out in the French Alps. He was able to go in and say, every time that we bring in a new distillery here, it's really important that we don't disrupt the culture. That is a critical part of it. Yeah, listen, I'll be the first to admit there have been things they've modernized from our sales and our route to market approach. But I can say, hand on heart, I've never heard someone from Remy say, oh, I wish you did this, or I wish you did that, or have you considered this? I don't think they would dare to do it. One, because Westland is full of a bunch of like headstrong, very independent people. We're a bit of a magnet for that sort of an attitude, for better or worse. It can make for very interesting meetings as an individual team. But more than that, it's that I think at Westland in particular, had they come in and tried to dial in things or change things, it would have been even more noticeable because of how fierce that independent streak was in us.
So there's a lot of similarities then between Bruichladdich and Westland. So you all get in the room and swap notes and share information, and does it work?
100%. I mean, their production team, Alan Logan, Adam Hannett, their entire production team are just fantastic. And I know, our blender, Shane Armstrong, and Matt, our master distiller, and Scott Sell, our director of ops, and Tyler Peterson, our distillers manager, they spend an enormous amount of time going back and forth with those guys. Now, obviously, they're at a scale that's a little bit different than ours. I mean, we are a fraction of the size of Bruichladdich. Bruichladdich has had an unbelievable run of success over the last, dozen years or so that they've really developed into a major player in single malt Scotch whiskey. I would like to think at some point Westland can make the same impact on its own industry the way that Versatility has. But what they've been really great about is kind of showing us the opportunity that exists to keep that brash, outspoken, defiant attitude, but also, frankly, become a little more accessible to the new drinker. It's funny, Versatility, a brand that has, I would say, just such an incredible story, such a unique style of liquid, and like the classic Lottie, their entrance skew. You know, that's a whiskey that I think a lot of people would look at it and go, well, it's not really a whiskey for like new people coming in. But in fact, like, I think Versatility does an excellent job being like, brilliant. Yeah, this is something new. This is something you can try. And we've really tried to do some of that at Westland as well. It's not been like, oh, we're going to change our liquid, we're going to do this, we're going to do that to make that happen. It's been the way that we communicate, because I see this now, and Andy, I would imagine, sees this as much as anyone. The whiskey community is it's doubling in size what feels like on like a daily basis. It's no longer that the whiskey shows that I go to. Yeah. It's no longer that the whiskey shows basically are just like a room full of me's, which, I mean, that wouldn't even be fun if it was like, I can't stand myself enough to be in a room full of me's. So I think that's like a really important part of it. Like, I'm glad the whiskey industry's coming in. At an event last night, we had a ton of younger women at the event, a ton of people asking good questions, a lot more people of color. It's become a much more inclusive environment where these local whiskey societies are bringing great people in who just want to drink excellent whiskey.
And learn. There's an insatiable thirst, which is great from a distiller's standpoint. You know, you love engaging with people that enjoy whiskey, because that's how we started and still are. I was presenting last night with two other distilleries, friends of mine in local New South Wales, and I got up there, and one of the things I said is, first and foremost, I'm a whiskey lover. So I'm like you guys. You know, I get a buzz out of hearing someone talking about their story and answering questions. That's to me, that's the big part of it. That's got a G on.
Ooh, I know what that is.
Is with Australian Post, but I had the sherry. I enjoyed that. Thank you very much, Andy. I really enjoyed that. It's
I'm going to say that's the Gariana.
That is what it is.
Yep, that'll be it.
I pronounced that right, Gariana.
You did, yeah.
I'm really excited by this. So why I'm pouring?
I'm so upset that we don't have it, because it sounds fucking amazing.
The whole concept of a different white oak, and what I've read about it is, it's exciting. So, Chris, tell us about it. Tell us where it started. I mean, where it started, and where's it going?
Gariana's origins are almost as old. Gariana as a part of Westland are almost as old as the origin story of Westland. So what is Gariana is maybe the easiest thing to start with. Gariana is a local species of oak, or an indigenous species of oak to the Pacific Northwest. So for those folks that aren't like terribly familiar with the geography of the U.S., when I say the Pacific Northwest, I'm talking about the state of Washington. So obviously out in the northwestern corner where we're from, Oregon, I would say Idaho, parts of Montana, certainly Western Montana. And you could make an argument, even though I think people in Washington and Oregon would argue against this, but parts of like Northern Cali could probably get some level of agreement to being part of the PNW. You know, back in the 1850s, Gary Oak was pretty widely populated throughout the Pacific Northwest. It was really sort of accessible everywhere. And what you found is from the 1850s through today, it had the unfortunate trait of wanting to grow, or having these sort of Gary Oak savannas where people wanted to put housing in. And what they didn't take into account is that we had basically just completely devastated this resource over the last 150 odd years, to the point where Gary Oak grows in about 5% of the native habitat that it did back in the 1850s. I mean, it really is in rough shape right now. Now, that probably sounds like an interesting thing for me to say, given that we're a brand that works with Gary Oak casks. But one of the really unique elements of this is that in our Gary Oak project, we work with fallen trees. So we don't actively go out and source fresh cut Gary Oak trees. In fact, in the state of Oregon, it's like a $10,000 fine for cutting down a Gary Oak tree. Yeah, it's a really sort of aggressive fine. So we work with these cooperages locally. We work with local lumber mills to identify what you would describe as like hazard oaks. So oaks that have the potential to fall on someone's home, or oaks that have just fallen down after a forest. We've literally had to develop this economy organically to go out and like source these things, because there wasn't really anyone doing with it. Because, and this gets to the sort of style of it, Gary oak is a very different flavor profile from European oak, from frankly even just classic Quercus alba white oak in the States. Garyana is naturally phenolic. Think about all the flavors that exist in white oak, right? There's like that vanilla, butterscotch, coconut cake kind of thing going on. Garyana is all of those flavors with a dash of liquid smoke covered in barbecue sauce. Like, that's the best way to describe it. So it's nutmeg, clove. Yeah, it's like a lot of nutmeg, clove, ginger. I get a lot of like beef pan drippings to it. It's very meaty, really kind of big and oily. The tasting note I get quite a bit from folks is like, it's got a bit of like a Jamaican pot stilled rum funkiness going on.
Jamaican me hungry.
The neat thing about Garyana is like, before we released Garyana, we've been doing Garyana as edition starting back in 2016. So Garyana edition 1 came out in 2016. We've just released Garyana edition 6, which my assumption, Craig, is that you have Garyana edition 5. Andy can probably.
No, Crafty will have number 4.
Oh man, that's pretty awesome.
We had 5 here in market in Australia, just a small allocation, and it did go very quickly.
I'm not telling you when that arrives.
Just waiting for number 6 to get over here.
So what's started back in 2016 with edition 1, but actually prior to that, and these are the things that like I kid you not, I get emails every week from collectors being like, "Hey, where are those single casks?" We released a handful of single casks of Garyana, which, if you ask a lot of the folks on the Westland team, and Matt I think would come on and say the same, I would argue they were too much. They were intense. I mean, those whiskeys were like, you needed a knife and a fork and a napkin to kind of chew through them. They were big, aggressive bottles of whiskey, and people went nuts for them. So this is, I want to say that was like cask 117, 118, 115, and it might have been I think it was 115 through 118. So these are the 4 single casks, and they got released to various retailers around the United States. When we started doing the edition series of Garyana, the way that people associate, I think, with them now, which is, comes out every September, October-ish, assuming that we can get goods moved around the world with some level of ease, and then in really small quantities, we recognize that we could make a really interesting whiskey that showcased a lot of Garyana flavor, but only used a couple of Gary oak casks in the vatting. I think I'd have to look up the tasting notes back on 4. It's been a couple of years at this point, but if you were to think about that whiskey, the reality is like, rarely do we exceed 25% Gary oak casks in the vattings for those things. Right. And you can still pick up such an immense amount of that flavor coming through. So the 4, if memory serves correct, was where we really kind of went heavy with quite a bit of sherry casks in there, because we wanted to show off kind of like the full-bodied element of sherry, along with sort of like rich, spicy element that kind of comes through from Garyana. And they really do work well. But I think if you were to look at just like a pure profile sheet of like what sherry does and what Garyana does, you'd probably think, wow, this is going to be way too big on the palate. But it's a big whiskey, and keeping them up at strength, up at 50, does a nice job at helping balance out some of the casking elements there.
Very cool.
There's a lot of elements in there. Just looking at the cask types of the edition 6, where you've got second fill Pedro Jimenez 65%, the Virgin Garyana at 25%, ex Calvados, ex American Grape Brandy, and Washington Apple Brandy.
Wow.
Yeah,
there's a lot.
6 is a bit of a kitchen sink. Yeah, there's a lot in number 6. I'll tell you, I was tasting it last night, and I'm really enjoying that whiskey. But each of them have such a unique profile, and that's something really important to us, is that, whereas some people make a limited release annually and it's the same product year after year after year, which there's no fault to that. That's their prerogative. With Garyana, we want to showcase the versatility of the species of oak. So we're going to use it with a variety of different types of other casks, a variety of different other types of mashes, or barley bills, if you want to call them, because we want to show that, like, yeah, Garyana can do a whole lot of interesting things when you work it the right way.
And different strengths as well. So edition 6 is at 50%. What's the?
I'll tell you.
edition
Yeah, I'll
four?
tell you a funny story. So they've all been 50% since edition 3. So and there's a great story here. So edition 2 of Garyana was meant to be bottled up at a higher proof, and we had a mishap in one of the warehouses, and for some reason a tank got mislabeled or something, or a tank was misunderstood what it was, and it got watered down to, I want to say on that one it was 53, but God, I'd have to look back. It's been a number of years now. And we tasted it and we were like, oh, actually, this is great. Like, this is really, really good. Something that, like, in Garyana 1, we were like, no, we're just going to do them as like that at cast strength. And then the next year we were like, all right, let's try it at 50. And we were like, oh yeah. And this was early days of Westland, when like the demand for Garyana so vastly outstripped the supply of what we could make, that we were like, yeah, we'd like there'd be enough of this to like get out. I mean, I remember, Australia was a market that got pretty early batches of Garyana. Japan was one that got pretty early batches of Garyana. And like, people would be like, okay, we're going to place our order for more Garyana. And we'd be like, oh yeah, there, to be very clear, there is no more until like September of next year. And people were like, well, but we want more now. So there's the balancing act. And I'm Craig, I'm sure you go through this as well. It's like, you want to make sure that people have access to things that they're really excited about, but also you have to protect it, because you can, I don't know if it's an expression that exists in Australia, but I call it like the hug of death, right? Where like you love something so much that you inherently ruin it. And that's not what we want to do. We want to, if in fact, the series that Garyana belongs to, called the Outpost range, is expanded this year with a new whiskey called Calere, which is entirely focused on barley. So it's the success of these things that's allowed us to expand the horizons of working with new types of raw materials. And, I'll make the kind of impassioned plea back to, like, when Westland was an independent distillery, the amount of capital that would have been added in to continue to do these projects was so incredibly high, that having Remy come in as a parent company that like literally, I mean, Remy has been just fantastic in this regard. They've come in and they've basically said to us, like, we think this is super interesting as well. How much do you need to do these things? And we've been like, sheepishly writing a number down, and they're like, yeah, go do that. And that is, I'll tell you, there's a really compelling part to being able to go to your parent company and say to them, like, we believe this is meaningful. We can't promise it's going to return a huge amount of like profit, or it might not be profitable for ages. But what we can do for you is we can show you that like the world of whiskey has so much more to offer than 2-row pale malt in ex bourbon aged for 10 years, bottled at 43% with a chill filtration. Like that the world does not need another one of those.
No, it's pushing it. I'll tell you a funny story, an Australian story. So, have you heard the brand Bundaberg?
Oh yeah. Ironically, it is usually in this hotel's minibar. I kid you not.
Yeah, that wouldn't surprise us. So Bundy has a lot to answer for. A lot of sore heads, people in their 20s that that they had a bad experience and they went, that's it, rum's not for me, right? Same as some people had a bad whiskey experience. Anyway, I know someone who worked at Bundy, and he was part of a group, and they went to Bundy management and they said, can we please make rum? And they went, what do you mean? They go, can we please go and get some barrels? Can we please make some really high quality rum and show that we can make really high quality rum? And they did. And they won world's best rum. This was about, 5 years ago, I think. You recall, Andy, when this happened, when Bundy won? And it was like, bugger me. They can make rum. And that actually became a division, my understanding, within Bundy. And they released these special cast release rums, and they're highly sought after, and they're cracking rums.
They're really good. My first experience with Bundy was up in Townsville, and we called it fighting juice up there. But these like small batch rums they do are really good.
Oh man, I'm finally getting the taste of Australian strange words that I was really hoping for this entire time. Like, Andy, I just want to be clear. I think I just heard you refer to something as fighting juice.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh man, this is warming my soul in such a good way. Like, this is fantastic. I just want to point out when you guys were saying Bundaberg, however it's pronounced, forgive me. We think of it here in the States, it's like a ginger beer. It's like a little capsule ginger beer, and they make like soft drinks. Oh, okay.
Yeah, they do. They do all those, the non-alcoholic versions, but then you've got your Bundy rum,
Got
which
it.
has
Okay.
a polar bear as its mascot.
Oh, I wonder if
I
it's
don't
owned
know
by the
why.
same people that make Polar Beverage, because that's the same in the U.S.
Yeah, right. They did some amazing ads in the 90s.
They were brilliant.
Yeah.
The polar bear ads, they're very, very Australian. Even though it's a polar bear, they're very Australian ads. Look it up on YouTube, Bundy polar bear.
All right,
yeah.
we'll do.
It's very good. I'll give you another story too. This is to show you that screw-ups can actually result in a good product. So a distillery not far from me, about an hour from me, called Baker Williams. And Nathan worked with grape spirit and grain spirit. And one day he was decanting one vessel into the next and went, fuck. And he'd mixed them, right? And he was really pissed off. He was like, shit, what do I do? So he left it in his shed, and it's a small shed. And every time he went past, he'd just kick it. It was like a ritual. You know, he'd walk from one end of the shed to the other, kick it, kick it, kick it. And then one day he tasted it, and he thought, bugger me, it's not bad. So he released it as a product called Wildcard, and it became highly collectible. And it was
Man.
Andy? Wildcard?
No, I don't know about that one, but I love the story.
Yeah,
I just love that he kicked it every time he walked past. Like, that's just, I can imagine, I grew up on a farm, and I could just imagine my dad doing that. Like, every time, you know, a broken down motorbike or something, he just walk past and kick it.
You can swear under his breath. Bastard.
Oh man, I Craig will know exactly what I'm talking about here. But like, anytime you get a stuck mash, the type of cursing you hear out of a distiller, it is like the most. Like, I'll be honest with you, craft distillers are creative cursors. They really are. Like, we run some of these new varietals of barley that we've been working with up in Skagit, or from Skagit Valley. Some of that stuff, it runs a little differently, and there's a bit of a learning curve there with that. And it's like, oh man, when there's been like an interesting mash day with a new varietal, like, I learn new words that I've never heard before.
Yeah, Crafty knows all about that.
I'll let Luke and Todd tell you.
There's too many stories about
so
that.
where do we
though.
start?
Yeah, which one?
One. I'll kick it off, and you can finish it. So basically, I was in the shed, milling, brewing, distilling, right? And my phone was ringing all the time, and I had to make all these calls. So I thought, I got to do something. So like, Andy's got a headset on. I put a headset on, and I made my calls, and I kept working. And Luke, you want to finish the story? What happened?
Was that when I came in the first time?
No.
No, you'll have to carry on the story without me.
So,
All right, Todd, you go.
Todd,
You know.
Todd knows it.
apparently there's rather important parts of a mash tun, and Crafty left out an important part. So when he went to pump across his wash, it was full of grain.
Oh.
So that's
So
the
That's
reason
your little basket, wasn't it?
Screen in a mash tun.
Yeah.
And I found out the hard way. So I forgot to put the screen in.
Thankfully, it wasn't 7,500 litres like someone else's mash tun.
It's enough of a freak doing it on my little 24 litre, let alone doing it at your scale and then your scale.
I mean, I look at like the level of automation at like really big facilities, and I go, oh man, it must be so easy for them. And I'm like, no, things break no matter where you are, no matter what your size. Things break.
And
Things are
people
like
forget to put the thing on.
Murphy's Law is an equal opportunity destroyer of happiness.
Yeah.
Like it exists everywhere.
Yeah. Chalking your barrels is also a good thing, isn't it, Crafty?
What was that?
Chalking your barrels, writing the names on in chalk.
Yeah. So when you get barrels from a cooperage, and they're different sorts, and they've just chalked the barrels as opposed to labeling the barrels, so the barrels
Oh
are wrong.
no.
What's that one? I don't know. What's that one? I don't know.
Oh man, that is.
Discern it, but the chalk's faded away. And anyway, we're telling you all the stories of Australia. Let's move on. I got a question. So in Australia now, there is close to 400 distilleries. I think that's the latest count, close to 400. Now, population is, what's the population, guys? I always get this
like
wrong.
24 million.
25.
25 million.
25 million.
Yeah, 24, 25.
Yeah, so 400 distillers, 25 million. And I remember in 2017, America had 1,000 distilleries for your population. There's
about 350 odd million. Yeah.
Yeah. So, it's very interesting looking at the numbers. What's the numbers in America now?
Oh God, I couldn't even begin to tell you the number of distilleries in America. Admittedly, a terribly quick Google search would probably tell us. But here's what I can give you a sense, maybe more specific to single malt whiskey in America. So when we started the American Single Malt Whiskey Commission back in 2016, there were like 8 producers making single malt whiskey in America, of which, Westland was one of the few that was like exclusively making single malt whiskey. There were other distilleries that were making it as an adjacent. They were doing a bourbon or a rye, and maybe they were making single malt, or they were doing single malt plus a gin or plus a vodka, those kind of things. I want to say now, last count for the American Single Malt Whiskey Commission for like actual members, there is well over 120.
Wow.
And we're talking about like a 4.5-ish year window. I mean, it's a huge level of growth of that. So I think the challenge here is, listen, the prohibition of alcohol that happened, obviously ages ago, has still had a long tail in terms of its impact on the way that people think about distilled spirit products. And it's gotten better, and laws have been really kind of set up. Whereas, a lot of states have done great laws to be very advantageous for like craft breweries, but they've not necessarily extended that same thing to distilleries. We're really fortunate. Washington State was one of those states that was very clear, like, no, we want to incentivize local people to open breweries, open distilleries, to showcase sort of what's accessible here. So in that case, it's been really good for us. In fact, if memory serves correct, like Washington State for the longest time, if you wanted a craft distilling license, like half of your grain or half of your raw materials needed to be sourced from the state, and you got a reduced tax threshold. So there's a real financial incentive for doing so, which, I mean, you think about that sort of that cyclical impact on farmers, on maltsters, on coopers. I mean, all of those are really good things to be adding to the marketplace.
Mm.
Yeah.
And so looking at those, the American marketplace of single malt, who else would you be looking at as people to watch?
Yeah, I'm glad you didn't use the word competitors, because I think that's we have to be careful. Like right now, we are in the midst of this like 1970s Napa Valley wine thing going on with American Single Malt, where like I genuinely want my friends who are at other distilleries to be successful, because we're very much in this rising tides moment, right? We need more people to become aware of American Single Malt. And if that means they pick up a bottle of Balcones, Jared Himsted's a good buddy of ours, or the stuff from the folks over at Colkegan down in Santa Fe, or Gareth from Virginia Distilling, we want to see those things happen. We want people to be experiencing great American Single Malt, and we want to show off, frankly, the versatility of the way it can be made. What we do at Westland isn't what Balcones does, isn't what Santa Fe does, isn't what Virginia does. Like, one of the neat thing that's going to come out of this, and you think back to the origins of Scotland, right, with this sort of regional typicity, the 6 regions, and whiskey had a certain sort of sub-profile to it, because the technology didn't exist for them to make whiskey in a different way where they could say like, oh yeah, we'll just make Islay-styled whiskey everywhere. The reality is now, there's very much the tech exists where you could make any style of whiskey you really wanted to with little effort. Raw materials are immensely sourceable. If you've got an open checkbook, you can do those sort of things. But what we found, especially in American Single Malt, is there's been this huge sort of like localization element where, Santa Fe uses quite a bit of mesquite, which is a local species of wood down there. Balcones uses some post oak, which is about as Texas as it gets. Virginia's using some Virginia grown grain. It's like, those are really compelling elements to it. And it's creating this almost natural regional style guidelines there. And to be clear, we're not telling people they need to do this. In fact, I'd openly hope that over time people will go out of their way to say, like, what if we tried to make this, region style of single malt as like a fun off or a one release? And I think we'll see some of that.
That terroir approach of the unique individual taste of a region, I think is immensely exciting.
Agreed.
Yeah.
As we see from Waterford, where they're able to show that farms next door to each other can have a completely different flavor profile. Seeing that on a much larger scale across a continent, I think is very exciting.
But it's also
Australia's,
isn't it? It's a global
Australia's
thing.
one of the only other countries that can, I think, appreciate this. People lose sight of this, and Australians won't, because you're obviously a very large landmass as well. I mean, we're 5,000 odd kilometers east to west. We have massive variations in temperature, in soil types, in, frankly, culture of people. All of those things play a role to what you can produce. Admittedly, I've never been to Australia. Andy will know this. I was designed to come out here, and then the world went to shit 18 months ago. And hopefully over time, I'll be able to get out there, because we laugh about it, because I was thinking to myself, I was like, God, I can't wait to see another place where, from a single country, you can see just the breadth of how different a place can be. I mean, my assumption is Australia's got this great East Coast, West Coast differential like we have in America. And to see those kind of things, and to see how different sort of provinces or different states act differently, or it'll be interesting to see that shown in food and beverage, because we certainly have that here in America.
One thing that we saw, which it was a real eye-opener actually, directly related to COVID. Each of the states basically took control of their own states and run them almost as autonomous governments. So we're a country, but we're a federation of states. And Andy, you know what I'm talking about here. Victoria was doing its own thing. New South Wales is doing its own thing. WA,
they're still doing their own thing.
They're doing their own thing.
Always do their own thing.
We're going to be able to go to Bali before we can go to Western Australia. It's strange, but on that note, and this is a bit tongue in cheek, but so the spiritual home of whiskey, single malt whiskey in Australia, is Tasmania, right? And a lot of people train in Tasmania to learn how to distill. But the Tasmanians are very, very proud of the fact that they're Tasmanians, and they're actually pulling away from Australia. It's like, we're not Australian single malt, we're Tasmanian single malt. So we give it back to them and go, the mainlanders are doing okay. They're doing okay on the world stage. So Tasmania, you might want to come back in the fold of Australian single malts, because it's a bigger category.
I mean, I would argue, if you came to my house and you looked in my cupboard, I think I would venture to say now I have a handful of Australian single malts. Whereas if you came to someone in the States 5 years ago and said, do you have any Australian single malts? They'd be like, I think I've seen a bottle of Lark before. Yep. That would be kind of what they would have said. And It's great to see that. I mean, obviously I laugh because David from Starward now lives out on Bainbridge Island, not even a 25-minute ferry ride from Seattle. So I see him all the time. And I always giggle, because it's just it's amazing. I've seen him more in Europe than I have in Washington State, because of just doing road shows and traveling and doing all this stuff. But I think his whiskey's excellent. I think there's a ton of great whiskey being produced out there. And I think if you walk into a retail store, whether it's a Dan Murphy's or a Nick's or a Binny's here in the States or K&L or any of those things, and you're just walking down and walking to the one thing you buy every time, you pick it up, you walk to the register with the blinders on, you are missing a world of single malt that's out there. And I'll tell you, hand on heart, we have never been in as good a time to be a whiskey drinker as we are right now. People say all the time, and there's this crazy bias of the old, where people are like, oh man, 20 years ago they did it like this. Yeah, but 20 years ago there was 6 producers, so that doesn't carry any water. The reality is that I mean, the stuff that's being made by the new school, and frankly, even the old school of single malt whiskey distilleries around the world, is just wild. I don't know how much access do you guys have to the milk and honey stuff the guys out in Israel are making, or the stuff that's being made by McMyra out in Sweden, or the stuff being made at High Coast. I mean, they're High Coast now. Those guys are just fantastic. Those whiskeys are incredibly just nuanced, with a lot of really cool things going on. And those are things 20 years ago just wouldn't have existed in any capacity.
Yeah. So I did we have a Whiskey Appreciation Society Facebook page, and it's got about 15,000 members in Australia. Well, there's some internationals as well. And one of the comments that comes through from Australian consumers is, why do Australian distillers use 500 ml bottles? And why is Australian whiskey so expensive? All right. So I did a Facebook post and I said, put those two things to one side, the bottle question and also the price question. What prevents you from buying an Australian single malt whiskey? And it was great. It was something like about 130 comments. And it was very good market intel, actually. So I'm going to print it off and digest it. But what came through loud and clear is, to me, some people had a bad experience with an Australian whiskey years ago, and in their mind, that's what Australian whiskey was now. And so I put a comment on and challenged that and said, guys, there's so much going on in the Australian scene. You've got a lot of new progressive distillers that are experimenting with yeast, with ferment times, with grain, and there's a level of sophistication coming in. And even the established ones, same thing. So it's a maturity that's happening in our industry. So people who have had an experience, with a hop tannic whiskey from 2010, 2012, give it a go again. And I'd say it's the same in the US. You're seeing just the level of sophistication, as you just said, Chris. It's exciting. It's very exciting, isn't it?
It is the golden age of whiskey drinking, not only from an accessibility standpoint, but just from the quality of what's being made. And I love the fact that there are people really proud of their own sort of region, their own area, their own culture, that want to make something that's indicative of that. I think that is excellent. I think the world needs more of that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Chris, as you said earlier, from doing your tastings, you're seeing a lot more younger people coming into drinking whiskey, a lot more females, a lot more diversity coming in, because, I like to call it male, pale and stale, the way that whiskey drinkers were 10 years ago. And they didn't care about their whiskey. They didn't care about the grain, the style of grain or anything like that. They just cared about the brand name and the age and the color. But with this, influx of newer whiskey drinkers, they want to know more about what's in the bottle, where it came from, the provenance, all that kind of a thing. We talk about Brook Laddie. They've got their Laddie recipe online for the classic Laddie, showing all the different cask makeups that go into that particular bottle. And it's these people that are driving that as well. It's not just Westland and Brook Laddie and the other distilleries making this whiskey, because there's people that are drinking it and they want to know more, and they're helping to drive the conversation as well.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And I mean, listen, smart companies are going to listen to those consumers, and if consumers crave transparency and they crave authenticity, you're going to see a lot more authenticity and transparency in the spirits industry.
Which can only be a good thing, really. I love, and I've polished off a good amount of the peated.
I'm on it now.
Nice.
Tell me about your peat. Where does peat come from?
Good question.
We source so I should be clear. We don't source peat. We source peated barley. So that's a minor distinction, but a distinction worth making. So we work with Baird's Maltings up in Inverness. So actually, and again, great sort of point of consistency. Also the same people that Brook Laddie work with for the Port Charlotte project. So the Port Charlotte barleys are coming. The Port Charlotte peated barley is coming from Baird's as well. We're getting their pretty heavily peated stuff. So at about 55 ppm, it's all non-coastal, non-island phenolic sources. So you don't get that. What I don't get out of ours is that big medicinal sulfuric note. I get more of, you get a touch of the wood smoke. You do get a little bit of like that vegetal phenolic quality to it, but not heavy handed. But I think what's really different about our Westland peated is that only a small amount of the barley that goes into that or cask that goes into that is actually peated. So that whiskey is a perfect example of the way that we produce spirit at Westland. So we don't make just a single mash bill, right? We don't or a barley bill. We don't just make 5 malt. We actually, for many, many years, we made 3 distinct mash conditions. We did our 5 malt recipe, which was the preponderance. That was the thing that we were certainly known for. We also did just a straight pale malt, which was good blending stock or vatting stock for us. But then we also made a straight peated run. So that's that Baird's heavily peated that you have there. So when you look at a bottle of Westland peated, it's evolved over the years, but the profile has been able to remain fairly consistent in that it makes up less than like 50% of the cask batting. So our battings are typically 30 odd barrels at a time. Only about half of them would have actually been peated spirit, whereas there'd been quite a bit of 5 malt and quite a bit of pale malt as well. And that's super important because what you end up getting out of that is, I always say, it's a sessionable peated whiskey. That's the kind of peated whiskey you can put in someone that's not a peated whiskey drinker. Listen, you take someone to the deep end of the pool and you're like, hey, drink Lagavulin or drink Ardbeg. Some people are going to float and some people are going to sink. And for us, it was, we didn't want to make that style of whiskey. One, because we weren't going to make it as well as they were going to. And two, it would be pretty ridiculous for a bunch of guys in Seattle to be like, yeah, we're going to make Isla style whiskey in Seattle, Washington. No, I think we can make a style of whiskey that's more akin to what we want to kind of showcase out of what our distillery can produce. So you still get a touch of that chocolate note coming through on that.
It's a very approachable peated whiskey.
Yeah.
That doesn't have that I've just licked a bitumen road after a bushfire feel to it.
True.
Yeah, it's certainly one of my favorites.
Yeah. No, I love it too. Chris, when you come here, you have to, Andy will make it happen some way. You'll have to meet a distiller. It's called the Mad Professor in Australia, Peter Bignell.
We'll try to get Chris down to Tasmania.
You've got to get him down there, mate.
Our last episode, have a watch of that.
Yeah.
It was with Peter Bignell from Belgrove. I was blown away.
Yeah, he's a mad bastard. But anyway, Peter.
Using a stranger, that's just weird shit.
Yeah, it is. He wanted to make a very heavily peated whiskey, and he released something, and it was called Bourbon Burnout. Right? Bourbon Burnout. So I was at a shop, the Oak Barrel, Andy, and I was going to taste a few whiskeys, and the guy there said, "Try this. This is the Bourbon Burnout," and he popped the top, and I went, "Jesus!" You had to pull your head away, right? And all you could taste in your mouth, and without even drinking it, but all you could taste was kerosene and rubber, right? So I actually walked away to the other side of the room because I wanted to try another whiskey, and I'm there going, I can't get it out of my mouth, and I haven't even. It's just airborne. It is brutal stuff. It really is. But that's the sort of thing some distillers do. Pete takes it to an extreme, and
And that's the thing, and there's a value. There's a value to that as well, right? Because I mean, part of it is we also want to explore the spectrum of what it means to be a peated whiskey. Peated whiskey isn't just Port Charlotte. It isn't just Ardbeg. It isn't just Lafroig. Like, peated whiskey can have an enormous amount of variance to it and what it can showcase. I think, you might have read at one point, but we've been sourcing quite a bit of local Washington State peat for a project that we're going to be releasing in January of next year called Solum. And what's really neat about that is that one of the things, there you go, some Octomore. Yeah. One of the neat things about this new project that we're going to have to explain to people when it becomes sort of available for us to go out and talk about for selling is, if you're expecting Octomore, if you're expecting Ardbeg, if you're expecting Lafroig, you're going to be disappointed because that's not what it's meant to be. It's meant to showcase what peat can be. I used to say this all the time, and I believe it to this day. One of the biggest crimes that whiskey ambassadors committed in this industry is allowing people to think that peat is a yes or no question. The reality is it is so much more nuanced than that. It is. I think of it as more of a flow chart, right? Yeah. The first question is this whiskey peated? Yes or no? Okay. Well, if it's peated, how much peat is being used? Is it the entirety of the vatting that's being used here? So in the case of Westland, it's not. Where is the peat being sourced from? How is the peat being handled? Is it in briquettes or is it in pellets? How long is the phenolic range left there? I think those are all really important components of understanding the spectrum of what peat can be. So if we allow ourselves to dumb it down to a simple yes or no question, we're not really going to explore the boundaries of what cool peated whiskey can be. I'll tell you, the peat bogs that we have out by us, I mean, they're loaded with like Labrador tea, which is a distant relative to to rosemary, and it's got this really wonderful like menthol eucalyptus quality to it. We've got wild crab apples and cranberries. This stuff, when it breaks down, it has. I was laughing. We did a sensory, I want to say in like middle of summer last year, to try a mixture of some new make of that peated stock, right, from our Washington State project, along with some of the more mature barrels. And it's really nuanced. But once you can start to like kind of sit down, listen, if it's the kind of thing you're going to sit and try to just knock back, you're not going to get the experience out of it. But if you sit and you're really kind of tasting it and like making your notes, you go, oh my God, there's all these cool things going on that like, I'm not sure I've ever had that flavor in a peated whiskey.
And I think,
so when can we get that in Australia?
So we're hoping, so the fingers crossed, and we're working on this now, but our plan is to release that whiskey globally in January of 2023. What the hell year is it? It's 21. Yeah, 23.
Yeah, we've got a while to wait.
Yeah, we're a little ways away, but admittedly, it's funny, when we started that project, we've been sourcing that peat for years now. The idea was, oh, well, we only need so much. And then as we grew as a distiller, we're like, oh my God, by the time we release this, we need a lot more of this whiskey available to like cover even the initial demand of the marketplace. So it went from being one of these things where it's like, oh, we'll just make a couple of cases, to being like, we're going to make hundreds of cases of that whiskey, and it will sell out. I would imagine Solom Edition 1 will sell out near instantaneously.
I'm definitely looking forward to trying it, because we talk about terroir with barley, but I think peat probably shows terroir more than any other part of the whiskey making process. When you look at the Isla style of peat, Orkney, you got the Highlands where we source ours from, and Brooklady as well. And if we look at Octomore gets two different types of peat, and the fields are 5 miles apart, and one has more smoke and one burns at a lower temperature. So that's what they use to make Octomore. And here in Australia, we do have peat here in Australia, which a lot of people don't think we do. Peat grows on every continent. We've got Cameron over in Western Australia. He uses peat from over there as well. Yeah. Even Luke, he's from Colac. And I think about 5 years ago,
there was a peat down there. It tastes like mud, though.
They had a peat field there that was on fire for about 3 months.
Yeah.
About 5 years ago. So it's definitely interesting to see the different styles of peat from different regions.
I was this close to buying a peat farm and then realised that it tasted like shit, so I won't do that.
They had a, where was it, Narra. They got a peat bog down in Narra, and that caught alight. That was during the New South Wales fires. Apparently, they had a real problem with snakes coming out of the bogs.
Oh my God! As someone that has like a deep-seated fear of snakes, that sounds like my literal nightmare.
You know that we have all the snakes that will try and kill you.
I am keenly aware of this. Believe me, like one of the sources of things I look at on Reddit is like animals that'll kill you, and it feels like every post is from Australia. It terrifies me.
Yeah.
We have some of the best beaches in the world, right, up in Queensland, and you just look at it and go, stunning, absolutely stunning. And it's just loaded with jellyfish. That'll just, it's just not worth the pain going out there in the water.
Oh,
have you heard of drop bears?
I have not, but now I'm a little. You just don't say it out loud.
Drop bears, mate.
Jesus,
deadly those things.
We're going to let you in on a little secret here. Don't fuck with them.
Yeah.
We try not to tell the visitors about them. But I consider you a friend. I'm going to give you a warning. Don't fuck with them.
They're like koalas, just bigger and more aggressive.
Big teeth, and they had claws, but they got claws which have been just over evolution. They've evolved, and they're just perfect for ripping human flesh. It's just
God,
they're not cute and cuddly. They are fucking horrifying.
I think I you'd have to look, and the interwebs will provide this at some point, but I feel like there was a video a number of years ago where like an American newscaster was brought to a place that had a koala, and like she had not seen one before. And yes. I think they like put on a whole thing where they were like, this is a vicious animal. And she was like terrified. They like made her put on like body armor and everything. They were just having a bit of a laugh at her, but it was like her fear was palpable. Like she was genuinely terrified.
I think that's where it actually originated. I saw something on CNN only about 6 months ago, and they dispelled the myth of the drop bear. And everyone in Australia went, oh, damn, We were enjoying that one.
Yeah, that's. Oh my God, that is fantastic! I mean, that's just amazing because my wife keeps saying to me when we go out to Australia, we're gonna stay and take some holiday afterwards, and she's like, I want to see a koala, I want to hold a koala, and I was like, oh my God, honey, like this is gonna be, but I'm gonna show her this, and that's gonna completely cure her of that desire.
They are not cute and cuddly. They will fuck you up.
They're a bit like kangaroos. So where I am out in the country, we have big roos, and they stand taller than me. And one night I was working on the still, and I opened the door, and there was a big bastard just standing at the door, and he's just ready to have a crack at you.
Let me in.
That's what they do.
Booze. I want the booze, mate. Give me the booze.
There was a video a couple of years ago about a koala that attacked a guy's dog, and the guy got up there and went and boxed the kangaroo to try and get it to go away and leave his dog alone.
I've seen that video.
It's so Australian.
Yeah. Fully legit.
I want to say we're hitting all of the things that I was hoping we were going to talk about today.
So as you can see, it's gone according to script. The script that we sent you last week, it's line by line.
We have talked about enough whiskey. Let's talk more about random Australian animals. I'm really liking this.
And I've literally just found the article where the woman is in her full-on body armor, goggles, and
that's right. She had goggles on. Yeah, it's like a whole thing.
Yeah. And she looks terrible. She was a Scottish lass.
Is that what it was? Okay.
Yeah, Scottish lass. They got a good. I'm sorry. I'm just going to put it up here for you, just to once it uploads, because.
Oh, that's fantastic.
But look at the koala. The koala's going, I'm so bored.
Yeah. I'm so bored and I'm so high.
Right. Well, it's 1:26, so we probably should wrap it up. Now, Chris, so you can...
Yeah, I feel like the point of the podcast where we're starting to show random viral videos, that's usually like the moment when I'm like, okay, we hit all the major points today.
Mate, it's been an absolute pleasure. It really has. Like I said, Westland for me has been very influential. So I've loved following Westland over the years, and it's just great to have an opportunity to talk to you about it. And you can see the authenticity is there. You really believe in what you're selling and the whole Westland story. So it's awesome. It really is.
It's really kind of you guys to have me on. I really appreciate it. This is. I tell people all the time, like, one of the great joys of my life is to share what we're doing here, because I really do care about what we're doing. And frankly, that extends it's not just me, the commercial guy, that extends to everyone at the distillery. Like, you could have had Ellie, our mash woman, or you could have had Tyler, our distillery manager, or you could have had Austin, one of our sales reps. You could have had any of them on and they would have had the same passion for what we do, because we really do believe in this. And, we're really fortunate. I get to work with great people like Andy all the time that just like, they see Westland for what it is and they recognize what it can be. It's going to take time. Listen, Rome wasn't built in a day, and that's the great example of it takes a lot of effort in this business to make something a success. But you can't. I don't even think you can begin to climb the mountain of what that needs to look like unless you make great whiskey. And we're really fortunate that I think we make great whiskey.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, everything I tasted tonight, I haven't tried a Westland for about 2 years, and it just reminds me of why I drink Westland. It's very diverse, great flavors, full of flavors, big punchy flavors. Great.
Well, when I come out,
really,
Craig, I'll bring you some lab stuff of some cool stuff. We'll bring some cool stuff out and we'll try to get together. Andy will have to arrange the calendar so we can actually get a night of good drinking in together.
And we're not going to allow Crafty to handle the postage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was going to say,
carry
boys,
on only.
This is a risky play. You're calling out the Australian Post in a podcast that's going to get some level of viewership. I guarantee you, someone that listens or watches this is with the Australian Post. So I just want to be clear: Westland has nothing to do with this.
Hang on, Australia Post will get the message in about 2 weeks.
Zing.
If
So what will happen?
If they're lucky.
In Australia, we have Telstra, right? And there's a stand-up
Telstra.
comedian.
So let's pick on them now.
Yeah.
Yes, there's a stand-up comedian in Australia called Carl Barron. If you want a good taste of what Australia's like, observational life, Carl Barron, comedian, fantastic. And he goes, Telstra should actually just be called Fuck Telstra, because that's how everyone refers to them. They just go, Fuck Telstra, Fuck Telstra. So Fuck Telstra, and Australia Post is
Australia Post. Absolutely.
Right. So hopefully we don't get in trouble for this.
We are never getting mail again.
And my phone stopped working all of a sudden.
Well, again, guys, a huge
thank you very much. It's been absolutely brilliant. Before we go, I need to give a couple of quick plugs to things that are happening this weekend.
Yes.
Unfortunately, guys, you're going to miss it because we've got the craft booze market just down the road from where we are now. Well, where Todd and I are now, that we'll be at. We've got
In Sydney.
in Sydney. So here in Sydney, if you are in Sydney, head down to Mobius Distilling on Saturday at about 11 o'clock, I think it is. Good for a lunchtime tipple. And there's going to be a whole heap of distillers and winemakers and all sorts of bits and pieces there, which will be awesome. So that is at Mobius Distilling this Saturday, the 11th.
In Marrickville.
In Marrickville. Mobius Distilling, check it out.
Yep.
And yeah, please do subscribe, like, follow, all the different things. We don't make any money off this. This is just purely for our own enjoyment. But please like it so that more people can find it.
There is another part to this, though. I'll just add to it quickly. The original concept with this was we wanted to give a platform to mainly Australian distillers, including us, where we can just talk, and just have conversations. So there's a lot of Australian distillers. I said there's 400 distilleries. So we talk with established distilleries. We talk with guys that are just putting their business plans together, the whole shebang. We talk to maltsters. We talk to cooperers. One of the great ones that's coming up in 2022 is we're going to have a conversation with Mark Rainier.
Oh, nice.
From Waterford. But we're having a conversation at the same time with a craft maltster in Australia, and it's going to be specifically about barley and terroir. So it's going to be probably a 5-hour deep dive, knowing those two, into that. So to be able to get Mark Rainier on is awesome. It's Stu Wycross from Voyager Craft Malt. It's going to be freaking awesome. So that's the sort of thing we like to do. So
absolutely,
we best let Chris start his day.
Oh yeah, I just realized I have literally a day full of work ahead of me. You really ruined that at the end.
There's almost that time where we might as well just stay up and go and start our new day.
Well, we've got a whole wall, so let's do that. And of course, Andy needs to go to sleep.
All right, I gotta go turn my still on. I'll go to bed.
Thank you all. It's been wonderful. Brilliant talking with you. I'm glad
thanks, guys.
Time's right. Eventually.
Cheers.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.